Hello, I'm Joyce Barrett, and I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. Webinars are brought to you by the generosity of Heritage Ohio donors. We invite you to become a supporter by visiting our webpage at www.heritageohio.org. Heritage Ohio's mission is helping people to save the places that matter, build community, live better. Today we will have a presentation on historic windows, repair or replace. We have 1.0 HSW AIA credits. Note in the chat box the link to the form for you to fill out if you want that credit, and I will be reposting that in a moment. You have to fill the box out. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. If you have questions, please type it into the question box at any time. Most issues with the webinar software will be solved if you close the program and restart it with the link that was sent to you. We will be sending the recording out later today, and we're in the process of loading the PowerPoints there in the handouts for you. Today we have two speakers. Mary Angela Feaster is the head of the Technical Preservation Services at the State Historic Preservation Office, and Charles McBrien is a retired window consultant. Well, window salesman and becoming a window consultant. So first I'm going to hand the presentation. The first half of the presentation will be with Mary Angela. So Mary Angela, you want to take it away?
Thanks so much, Joyce, and thank you to Heritage Ohio for giving us the opportunity to talk about windows today. I am so very glad I'm going before Chick, because Chick is an extremely hard act to follow, so I am very grateful for that. My focus today is going to be on windows and how they relate to tax credit projects. Chick, again, is the expert on actual replacement windows, so I'm not going to dwell on that much. I'm just going to talk to you about repair, and if you do need to replace, what kind of information will need to be presented for a tax credit project. So again, the focus on this presentation is what you're going to need with respect to information and documentation for your tax credit project. So as Joyce said, I'm Mary Angela Feaster with the State Historic Preservation Office of the Ohio History Connection. And the first thing that we're going to be preaching is repair as the first consideration. Historic windows are very significant character defining features of historic buildings, and every attempt should be made to retain them. So all the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation are very important, all of them. But there are a couple that kind of stand out. Standard 1, which is compatible new use, and Standard 6, which asks us to retain historic features and repair them rather than replace them. Because if you replace everything on your historic building, even if you replace it to match, what you end up with is a historic looking building versus a historic building. So the Standard 6 asks us to retain historic fabric and repair it. However, if the severity of the deterioration is such that you simply cannot repair the historic feature, then you can certainly replace to match. And if the feature is missing entirely, obviously you need to do a replacement. These are examples that show repaired windows. This is Fort Haze in the upper left, and those are the windows from Fort Haze. And through a combination of repair and replacement of specific elements of the windows, they were able to, for the most part, retain their historic fabric, their historic windows, and do a repair of them. Metal windows are a challenge for sure, but this is an example of a repaired metal window. It can be done. Not quite as easy, perhaps some would say, as wood, and I don't know that I would argue with that, but it certainly can be done. So you need to document deterioration if the windows are damaged beyond reasonable repair. You really need to do that via clear, documented photographs. So the photos must be taken on each floor of each elevation and of each different type of window. The National Park Service, who is the final signatory for federal tax projects, the Ohio SHPO is the final signatory for the OPTIC, the Ohio Historic Preservation Tax Credit. So we're the final signatory for that, but the National Park Service is the final signatory for federal tax credit projects. And they don't want to see just one or two photographs of your windows on a building, and you're saying, oh, see, these are demonstrating that all the windows need to be replaced. No, you need to do each type of window on each floor at each elevation. Window surveys, Chick and I remember the day that window surveys used to be required for tax credit projects. They are no longer required, but they are definitely welcome. And the thing that I really like about window surveys is that it forces a close look at your window. So does it really need to be replaced, or could it be retained and repaired? The level of deterioration is what determines whether repair or replacement is needed. That is what it's all about. Things like peeling paint or missing putty, or weathered surface, or just a small area of decay do not justify replacement. So this paint is failing, that's for sure, but that may be all. If you take a peek underneath at that wood doesn't look too bad. So maybe that in those instances, the failing paint can be removed, and maybe the wood needs a little bit of epoxy, and then you can repaint and you've retained your historic window. This is a metal window, doesn't look too bad either. It looks okay too. So maybe this one can just be repaired and retained. So thus the historic fabric is retained, very soundly meeting standard 6. Is this just surface rust on this metal window? If so, repair may be possible. I have a super quick story where on a tax credit project of some years ago, the Park Service sent me out to actually scrape the window to see if it was just surface rust and if the windows really needed to be replaced as the applicant was proposing. And in fact, it was just surface rust. And then they were told, okay, well, you need to retain your historic windows, deal with the rust, which can be a problem. You really have to get at that rust and deal with it. But then they were able to do it and repaint. So we always ask you to consider repair first. This is an image showing some epoxy repair that's going on. There are epoxy consolidants as well as epoxy putty that can be used to reform missing sections. Repair can also include routine maintenance and the stabilization, which I just mentioned, and also Dutchman where needed. So energy and health considerations. Remember that for energy performance, there have been multiple studies done. The most recent one out of California, where if you have your historic window and you introduce a storm window, a compatible storm window, you can get super good energy efficiency on that window. We just ask that the storm window doesn't interfere with the reading of the historic window. And, I am kind of biased towards exterior storms, and many people disagree with me on that. But the reason I'm biased towards exterior storms is because it lends protection to the historic window. However, interior storms can also be highly appropriate. And then fresh air needs. The need for fresh air in buildings has long been known. It's good for the building's health. It's definitely good for the occupant's health. But boy, oh boy, over the last year, have we not heard the importance of fresh air into spaces that human beings are occupying, being so important. And when you have your operable windows, you can get that fresh air in there. When are windows damaged beyond reasonable repair? Because sometimes you've reached that point. You've done your best, you've tried, and they just need to be replaced. So for wood windows, are the sills, are the jambs, are the sash badly checked or deteriorated? I'm showing you some examples here. This is probably, well, not probably, this is beyond the point of redemption for these little windows. Same goes here. I mean, you've actually got rot that is clearly visible. You've got super checked sills and jambs. And so really this has reached the point where repair is not reasonable. Probably could be repaired, but not to the point of reasonableness. And the standards just ask for you to try to repair them unless they are beyond reasonable repair. The same thing for metal. I showed you a couple images ago, metal windows that may be able to be repaired. This one has chunks of metal that are just missing. So the deterioration has actually eaten the metal away. Probably not a good candidate for repair. This is a cool picture because it's a repair and replace in one. So that bottom sash needed to be replaced because it was damaged beyond reasonable repair, which kind of makes sense because even on a double hung window, the lower sash is going to get the most up and down, even more so than the upper sash. So this is a great example of the application of Standard 6. They only replaced what they needed to replace. The sash that was repairable, they repaired, and they only replaced the sash that was damaged beyond reasonable repair. And by the way, they replaced it with a spot-on match. So determining the type of replacement, again, Chick is the expert. He's going to talk more about replacement windows, but I'm going to talk about the overall concept with respect to what we think about for tax credit projects and replacement windows. Not every window is of equal importance to the historic character of the building. Standard 2 of the Secretary's Standards for Rehabilitation tell us that the historic character of a property shall be retained and preserved, and the removal of historic materials or alterations of features and spaces that characterize a property shall be avoided. I told you right at the very beginning of the presentation that historic windows are super character defining features of a building, but they're not always equal. But when replacement is necessary, if the historic windows remain, how close the match must be will depend on what story it's on, the elevation, the visibility, and the level of craftsmanship. And again, this guidance is based for tax credit projects. So if the windows are on a primary or highly visible secondary, if the windows are on a primary or a highly visible secondary elevation, especially if they're on lower floors, then the match must be at a high level, spot on match. If the windows are distinctive or have a high level of craftsmanship, then the match must be at a high level. If historic windows are being retained, a good thing, and there are adjacent replacements proposed, those must be at a high level since you'll see both the historic window and the replacement window. If the windows are on a tertiary elevation, though, there is more flexibility, but the replacement still must be compatible for a tax credit project. So when replacement is acceptable, tax credit applications must include the following: photographs of existing windows, even if they're not historic, measured drawings, elevations and sections for both the historic window and proposed replacement in the historic openings. This means with dimensions. We need to see that. Proposed materials and finish, mock-up installations. We love, love, love mock-up installations. They used to be a standard thing. They are not required any longer, but I love them because they actually show what the window is going to look like in the opening. And remember, these drawings must be of the proposed replacement in the historic opening. So replacement windows on primary street-facing elevations of buildings that are 3 stories or less, and sometimes it's like 4 stories, so it goes between, must match in all details and preferably in materials. Replacement windows on any primary street-facing or highly visible secondary elevations that are part of the base of a high-rise building must match historic windows in all details and materials, and you can see why. Replacement windows above the base must match in any design or details that can be perceived from ground level. Now, it used to be people segregated more the types of windows that they used. Anymore, and again, Chick can speak to this better than I can, anymore what we're seeing in tax credit projects is applicants are just saying, you know what, I can get a better deal if I just get all windows sort of the same. Now in a building this size, I don't know if that's true, but on a regular, smaller size project, maybe that is true. So there's a cost benefit there. Replacement windows on secondary elevations with limited visibility must match the historic windows in size, configuration, and general characteristics. But this is where you get a little bit of a pass. But smaller details may not be absolutely necessary to replicate, and replacement materials may be considered. So you get a little more flexibility on those much less visible elevations. Now, replacement windows with significant interior components, though, must also consider the interior historic finishes and materials, such as this image that I'm showing you. An exterior match is almost always going to take precedence, though, but still, you need to respect the interiors. What if you don't have any historic windows remaining, but the configuration of the historic window is known from like pictorial or physical evidence, for example. The recommendation would be to replace with a compatible window of the same configuration. If no historic window remains and the configuration of the historic window is unknown, then the recommendation is going to be to replace with a window that is compatible to the building. Chick and I also remember the day when 1/1 windows were always the default. If you didn't know what window you had, you were always supposed to go with a 1/1. But that 1/1 window isn't always compatible to every building. I mean, think of a 1/1 window on an industrial building that would have had multi-light windows. Other configurations are probably going to be more compatible for that industrial building than a 1/1. So we've moved away from 1/1s as always being the default. Now, if you do not know what your historic window was, we are asking you to be compatible to the historic building. The key is always going to be compatible to the historic building, and for tax credit projects, it is a requirement. So some wrap-up tips. Retain your historic windows wherever you can, unless they are damaged beyond demonstrated reasonable repair and you document. When replacement windows are needed, select ones that best match your historic windows, if known, as they will be the most compatible to your historic building because it's what the building had historically. Tax credit project applicants who provide the following documentation at their first submission will further assist and expedite the review process. This is not required. The slide that I showed you a few slides back tell you what is required. These are just tips. If you want us, it'll just make it easier for us to do the review, which makes things faster for you. And Chick actually helped us come up with some of these. So each existing and proposed window drawing presented side by side on the same page. An overlay, we love overlays, an overlay of each existing and proposed window drawing with colors used to differentiate the units. Again, these are not requirements. These are just tips. These are, you don't have to do this. This is if you would like to. A supplemental window key plan elevation depicting the locations of all the windows that include information pertaining to the window material, configuration, operation, and installation, the date, the contribution of the property's historic significance, and then clear photographs of existing windows. That's not a thing that you can not do or do. That you have to do. And when windows are covered over, remove the covering for a sampling of windows in order to take photographs. Do your research. There are a lot of windows out there, and each one has its own features. For tax credit projects, we very strongly advise applicants. We can't require, but we very strongly advise applicants to not order any replacement windows until the National Park Service, again, the final signatory for federal tax credit projects, signs off on them, because you want to make sure that you have a replacement window that the Park Service is going to approve. So I've given you some sources that you can go to for additional information. I know this was super fast. I promised Joyce to keep it to 20 minutes. And I think she's going to be sending this out to you, so you will have all of these resources at your disposal. So if you have any questions beyond today's presentation, you are certainly welcome to be back to give us a call. I am so thrilled that we are back in the office for primarily most of the time. We just only have 1 or 2 days remote, so that's great. So that's it for me. Thank you so much. And now you get to hear from the master, Mr. McBrien. So thanks so much.
Mary Angela, do you have a moment where you can answer any questions if they're pertinent to your portion of the presentation?
Of course, sure.
Okay, everyone, Mary Angela has to leave. She has an appointment, but we grabbed her for the first half hour. So if you have any questions you'd like for Mary Angela to answer before Chick does his presentation, please type those into the question box.
And Joyce, just so you know, I shifted things around so I can stay until about 1 to 2.
Okay, okay. We'll still take questions right now if we can get anyone to type in. You've obviously been very thorough. We don't have any desperate questions coming in. We'll give it another second. For those of you who have joined us, both Chick and Mary Angela's presentations are in the handout box. Also in the chat box is the link for anybody who wants HSW AIA credits. Please click on that link. Okay, we have a question. What is a Dutchman from the early slide?
Oh yeah, sure. So let's say you have one piece of your wood window that's like super deteriorated, or there's like a chunk out or something. What you're going to do is you're going to clean up that pocket. And then you're going to take the same species of wood with the grain running the same way. And I understand that old growth and new growth wood are going to be a little bit different, but you're going to do the best you can. And you're going to then cut a piece to fit in there. But you're always going to want to make that replacement piece a little bit proud. And you're going to glue that in with really good, excellent exterior grade wood glue, and or you can also use some epoxy glue as well. But you're always going to want to make it proud, because the first time I did a Dutchman, I was like so proud of myself because I had done it like perfectly. It was so even, but then as the glue cured, everything shrank up a little bit. So it like sank down. So now I always do my Dutchman just a little bit proud, then I sand it down. And when you paint it, I'm telling you, unless you're looking for it, you're not going to be able to see it very well. And the benefit of it is you get to keep most of the historic wood, and you're only replacing that little section with new wood where it's missing or so damaged that you need to replace it with that new wood.
Okay, we have a few more questions that have come on in. Is there a list of recommended window restoration companies? I'm currently looking in the Toledo area. Mary Angela, as a state employee, is not allowed to make any recommendations. Heritage Ohio, we may not know everybody, but we have several major window companies that display and are sponsors at our annual conference. Those are the people who know. So if you want to, Frank, I might volunteer you. If you email Frank Quinn, Quinn, FQUINN, at heritageohio.org, Frank can perhaps provide you a list of the window manufacturers that we know from having worked with. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a comprehensive list, but it's people we know. Several more questions have come in. Would returning the historic windows to operable status be a requirement for tax credits?
No, that's not a requirement. As long as it looks compatible, as long as it looks like it can function, as long as it looks like a double hung, for example, if you historically had a double hung, the standards only allow us, and the Secretary of the Interior standards are the only metric that state historic preservation offices are permitted to use for the review of federal tax credit projects. And we also apply that same metric for state tax credit projects as well, so state and federal. And all the standards ask is for a review of material and visual impact. So if you're not adversely impacting the historic material and it visually looks appropriate, whether it goes up and down or not, then you're going to meet the standards.
Okay, and Zach pointed out for the question about window restoration companies, the Window Preservation Alliance maintains a directory on their site. So everybody go check out the Window Preservation Alliance. It's a great network anyway. Another question. If a building has several windows that are not replaceable, but you are planning on having exact matches built, is it better to replace them all or just have some replaced and others repaired?
That is an excellent question. And the answer would be only replace the windows that you need to replace. And what you're doing for yourself by having, I'm guessing this person is describing having the windows milled to match. What you're allowing then is for that spot on exact match that was referenced in an earlier slide. So there's going to be no question, because you're saying that you're going to have those windows made for you specially, then that's a window that's milled to match. And so you get the best of both worlds. You get to retain your historic windows, and where you can't because they're damaged beyond reasonable repair or missing, you're going to replace them with ones that are milled to match. So yeah, that's the best of both worlds.
Okay, any other quick questions before Chick starts? We'll pause for a moment. All right, so we are going to change presenters. And I'll welcome Chick. Let's get up there.
Thanks, Joyce, and thanks, Mary Angela. We are speaking out of the same hymnal. I've spent about 40 years in the window business in various ways, a lot working with architects and a lot on the education side, but most of it has been involved with historic. I retired January 1st and I'm really enjoying it, but I see there's a need for education, so I'm always happy to jump in on these type of presentations. So when to repair and how to replace. Let me just move a slide.
That's weird. I want to start.
Great. So we know the rules of the road. Mary Angela has given us that when involved with tax credits, but I have to tell you, their guidance is always good no matter what the project is, because we are stewards of these buildings. They're going to outlive us, and it's always right to do the right thing. So what do you do next? How do you do it? I think this is really important because a lot of what Mary Angela touched on when she talked about planning and documentation and the standards, that's what I've encapsulated here in this slide. Number one is collaborate with professionals. Number two, have good planning. And number three, inside that planning, document everything you do. The standards should govern everything we want to do in a rehabilitation project. And there's kind of an order to it. And if you look at the bottom, it says, we start with initial research, not just research, but the initial research. You may look at a building and say, well, this one's not going to work, or, this is perfect. Then you go into the assessment of the individual windows on the project. And as Mary Angela said, it's not a requirement, but I have to tell you, when you collaborate and offer all the correct documentation, you increase your chances of a positive outcome. The planning stage, again, in my opinion, really takes great collaboration, because do you have your time frame? Do you have the right players in place? Do you need installation? Do you need, ADA requirements to be made? So there's going to be a lot of different things that you want to look at in this, but remember that the standards are going to guide the whole thing. So my presentation is going to cover the research. Hopefully I'll give you some tips and help to better comply with the Secretary of standards by the Secretary of Interior. We feel after this, you'll be able to have greater confidence when to repair, when to replace. And Mary Angela had some fabulous slides on, beyond repair and non-beyond repair. But I must stress, every project is looked at on its own individual merits. And then I'll try to show a few case studies that speak to this. Mary Angela also did talk about initial planning, and the windows are the eyes of the building, and no window is the same. You'll have a building that has 100 windows, and maybe 20 of them came from 30 years ago, and the rest of them came from 90 years ago. So look at them close. Look at their shape and size, their mass and proportionality, because all that's going to become very important in your planning. And in your planning and your initial planning, the question always comes up to me, oh boy, I don't know whether I want to use an architect. I don't know whether I need, to use this person or that person as a consultant. Well, I have to tell you, it's cheap money. That's an overstatement of a broad subject matter, but I have found after 40 years, the cheapest thing you can do is deal with professionals. If you look at the circles inside the building here, this, by the way, is at Fort Haze also. But this is a general contractor, did not take the advice of his architect or his window supplier and supplied his own exterior trim. That exterior trim rotted in about 8 years because it wasn't of the right quality, and therefore not dealing with a professional, this window project pretty much went south after a 10-year period of time. Mary Angela covered this, but something I want to really reinforce to you is we're always looking for historic significance. And the 5 bullet points you see below cover those, and that's right out of the standards. You can read them in the right at national parks in their technical preservation aspect in the website. But it's not necessarily if they were the how old the building is. But Mary Angela touched on, do they show exceptional craftsmanship? How much in view are they? How much are they a part of the story of the building? So in your planning, there you have tons of tools. And I always say you can do this from home in your pajamas. The computer is a great help to us, but I want you to pay attention to the bottom there, because not only do we want to make sure we meet the NPS standards, but we want to make sure that we're meeting all the codes and requirements. Many of these buildings we work on were way before ADA came out. So what are we going to do with doors? What are we going to do about sprinklers? All those type of things have to be addressed, and how you're going to use the building becomes a very important part of that. I love this slide because it gives a real good why we do this. We're not only stewards of these buildings and keeping them alive as they should be because of their great architecture and their use, but we're using old embodied energy. We're not creating new. When Mary Angela talked about repair first, that's a key to all this. You're not burning embodied energy, which just wastes the environment for our grandkids. But I like to talk about the side issues. When we do rehabilitation projects, we are creating jobs. We are bringing taxes back in a positive way to buildings that many times sat vacant for years. So this is the one thing in talking to legislatures that we have found is this is not a Democrat, Republican thing. Everybody's in favor of doing these projects because it's good for everyone. So when you go into the National Parks technical website, they give you 4 approaches to the treatment of preservation. And I put this slide in there is because if you're thinking that you may need windows, it's safe to use the rehabilitation approach, because that is the one approach that gives you the leeway to either repair or replace, and many times do both. Because as you can see, we're not doing preservation, that's just maintenance. We're not doing a restoration because that depicts a property at a certain time in its history. And these words are very important when you file your Part 2, if it's a tax credit project, because the federal government and state government look at these words seriously and they mean a certain thing. So it's important for you when you're doing your research to think about, okay, what are my costs and what's my timeline? And that's the purpose of this slide. If you have minor repairs and you can scrape and paint those old windows, because again, most original fabric old windows are what we call old growth lumber. It's the best lumber you can get. And it's much better than any new window that's on the market today. So repair first, but check it out. Put an ice pick into it. See what it's like. Maybe it's just scrape and paint. Well, that's not going to cost much, and it's not going to take much time. So it gives you guidance. If you have to do some stabilization and repair some weathered wood like a Dutchman or something like Mary Angela was talking about, well, sure, that's going to cost a little bit more and maybe take a little more time. And then there's repair class 3, which is you're doing some major surgery to the window, maybe the frame. This is going to take more time and more money. So these are evaluations that you need to make on your building to figure out if it's feasible, if it's the right thing to do. And the presentation does have a link to the website to look further into this. when Mary Angela talked about the standards, there's 10 of them. And I've outlined in red basically what each one does. Number 2, number 6, and I think also number 9 really come into play. But number 6 is the important one, where windows are beyond repair or not existing. You know, there are a lot of buildings have both. And so you can view this again at your leisure when we have more time. But number 6 really covers that. And I'm going somewhere with this whole conversation, because when I talked about, and Mary Angela talked about documentation, comparative detailed documentation really helps a reviewer or any ARB that's reviewing a proposal. You help them make a decision. What's the mass and proportionality of the old windows? What's the daylight of the glass? What's the width between the masonry and the glass? How thick is that bottom rail? How deep is that bottom rail? How far does that window sit in there? That's why documenting everything you do is critically important. I put this slide in here for a double purpose. Many people say, well, that window is shot. Is that window beyond repair? Remember, every building is looked at on its own merits. So as an old window guy, I can tell you, I felt it was the obligation to do a window survey. It is not a legal requirement, as Mary Angela said, but again, if you want a positive outcome, I think it would really be important to create a assessment of every window at every location in the building. Again, being a good steward of this building, you're going to figure out what's needed. And then all of a sudden the building becomes alive. You have 400 windows and you measure 20 points of interest on each window. You now see like, wow, all the west side of those bottom rails are beyond repair. And what do you do this? I have a little caption at the bottom. It says, who are your 2 best friends? I have a terrible memory, and I found out a long time ago, my 2 best friends are my camera and an Excel spreadsheet. So document every piece, because 5 years from now, you may be asked to come up with some of that documentation. So when you're looking at details, looking at an old versus a solution, details are important. And you can see that matching certain details is going to make you a winner versus not get you approved. This is just remembering the number 6, where you have to document everything. It's very unique. This building here had a different width of authentic divided light bar in the bottom sash than it had in the top sash. It had a certain depth from the masonry to the glass. There were all things that needed to be documented. And here's an example of 3 things. In the upper left, you see what the federal government has on their website of what they want to see. Below that is just a spreadsheet that I used to put together, where I documented about 20 points on every window. It's a measurement: masonry, glass, check rail, bottom rail, locks, all things like that. So you have a documentation of every window, and then from that, you can put together a drawing of what the existing units look like, the old original fabric, and then you can go and find suppliers who can match that, and they should be able to give you a documented drawing with measurements that show the proportionality of their solution. And then you put those, the old and the new, next to each other, you get your closest match, you submit that for approval. So when you're looking at solutions, a lot of times you'll just get a piece of paper from a supplier, and you have to look really close at the paperwork, because as you see in the bottom detail there, there's a little gap. What that gap is covered is a piece of weather strip that's white, that is obviously out of character for a historic opening. You also see on the top of the window where the drawing shows there's actually a vinyl drip cap, in this case, that's on there that I'm sure historic review is not going to want to see. So your details are important to your solution, and you have to inspect your solutions diligently. So what are the solutions? I have to tell you, the most common one that I see is a little bit of everything. A project that you see in the picture, everything was done. Windows were repaired, as you can see from the beautiful, delicate upper sash. There were sash put in part of the bay window areas. Windows in the back of the building on each floor matched the same windows on the front of the building. The back of the building was very much a tertiary elevation, and therefore we took the good windows from the back of the building, put them in the front of the building, and then put replacement windows in the back of the building. So one solution does not fit all. There are a lot of solutions, and many times it's mixed. Mary Angela covered retention of the original materials and features is always preferable to replacement. I stand by that. I always know that we report to a lot of masters when we do a project, and that's why on the right-hand side of that, you see what I call a blower door test. Your windows have to look right to meet review, but they have to operate right to meet the owner's requirements. So I always advise people to do a blower door test before and after anytime you do a repair. But that National Alliance is a good website to find repair people around the country. So what are your solutions if your windows are not existing, they're beyond repair, and they're not the original fabric? Maybe you're dealing with second, third, fourth generation windows. You could put storms or secondary windows. You could do sash. You can do a full frame replacement or insert replacement, or a complete perfect replication of the existing. And you see the question mark. I'll cover those because I've been asked for years, what's a full frame replacement? What's an insert replacement? But in your solutions and in your specifications, take a look at the building on the right. Look how delicate the windows are. You can hardly see the frame, but you see a lot of glass. So that mass and proportionality of wood versus glass, that's important. You know, what do the mullions look like? What do the transoms look like? What do the mutton profiles look like? How deep are they? How wide are they? What's the glass? What are the characteristics of the glass? Is it stretch glass? Is it old glass? Is it new glass? Is it colored glass? Is it art glass? And then something that most people don't look at when they first look at a building is, what's the brick mold look like? When you get on an important building and those first couple floors, the brick mold really characterized the opening. And that's the piece of wood usually that went around the perimeter of the window. So check the details and document the details. And then all you're doing is, if you've done your survey, you're basically just dumping all that into your supplier and your documents. That's what you want to replicate. You want the joinery, you want to match the daylight opening of the old and the new. All those things need to be the best match available. So I've put this slide in here from a previous presentation because I've been asked so many times, what's full frame replacement? That is when you gut an opening. It's full surgery. And then you're probably going to put some wood blocking in, and it gives you the opportunity to get the closest match with the new. But know that all these things have an associated cost. So one solution is not always the same building to building. What's an insert frame replacement window? You can look on the drawing. The piece in white is the old existing jamb of the window and brick mold. You see the little white blocks on the exterior. They remain, and then a window goes inside that. An insert window for historic purposes is very infrequently used if it has to meet tax purposes. But Mary Angela made the case perfectly when she said if there are significant interior features. I want to point out that when you put a window inside an old window frame, you lose daylight opening. And therefore, you're really changing the look of that opening. So you better have a really good reason to do it. And I'll cover that in a few slides. Now, here's a full frame solution. And the purpose of this slide is actually personal for me, because I was asked by this actually university to look at this project years ago. And they said, nobody can go in, but you can look at it from the outside. And I said, well, I'm sorry, I can't do that. If you look real close on the bottom right, that is actually a square window with a radius sash inside that square window. So my message to you is, when you're doing your research, do all the details, go to the effort needed to get the right solution. Here's just a nice full replacement job over in Dayton, but that was completely gutted. And that's the answer to my pop quiz about 9 slides ago. Are these beyond repair? I also mentioned that sometimes you have older fabric. This is a school that had replacement windows put in. They lowered the ceiling. So it's important to get the details of what the original fabric windows look like and try to replicate those. Years ago, before we got electricity, light was a big problem. So a lot of storefronts and buildings used their transoms to reflect and reflect light into their buildings. So it's an important point. I don't know if you can see in the picture, but the windows had been closed, the transom windows have been closed in, and they were able to be reopened with just a very simple change, and it really made the project. There's some projects where you have to restore the past, changes in a building over time. Here's an inspection where the person inspecting looked to the side and said, oh, I know what this is supposed to look like. And therefore you can make the replacement on the outside look right. I'm oddly frequently asked, I can't find triple hung windows. There are a lot of good suppliers who are able to supply triple hung windows. And putting a transom over a double hung is not a triple hung window. There are plenty of good suppliers out there today for you to find what you need. And so you want to replicate the old details as close as possible for your submittal. We talked about secondary windows or storm windows. I love them because they let the owner accumulate money. They're cost effective. They're reversible. You haven't done any damage to the original fabric. They're compatible. They're usually daylight opening size the same, and they do create more thermal efficiency. In some cases, this can be a great solution. What does that look like? If you see the red line, I'm trying to draw attention to the fact that a storm window, as Mary Angela said, I agree with her. I have a problem with most storm windows because I think the plane of the window needs to be balanced with the old window. And the solutions you see here are correct because they don't protrude past the plane. This is just an example of what that looks like when it's done. We talked about insert windows and understanding the relationship of a significant interior. You have in a tax credit project an opportunity to put information in what is called the narrative. And when you get to that narrative, if in this particular case, the people were very clear about we have this fabulous interior trim and we don't want to mess with it. That would be one reason that it may be approved to put an insert window. So you're trading the daylight opening value for the importance of the interior value. And this is what that again looks like in plain. Sometimes you just need a frame. This is a project where a frame was provided when the old frame after 120 years was completely rotted, and they used the old stained glass, and the frame was made to fit the stained glass. Mary Angela talked about all full custom replication. And I caution everybody, when someone says, I need windows, I would suggest you do the Columbo with them and say, okay, how custom do we need to get? Because a true custom, every piece of the window being custom made is going to have a different cost than a semi-custom where you use a basic window but you use a custom brick mold casing or something like that. Storefronts, all available. High rises are really a special occasion because the owner has to balance not only historic, but performance. And you notice a lot of the old buildings were single glass and they had offset sash, as you see there. Well, there are windows now that made that look like offset sash, but they pivot in instead of slide up, and they give the owner the performance they need. Now, I want to take 2 minutes before questions and show some of the manufacturer's updates that I've been able to see that have addressed a lot of the National Park Line guidelines. So what does review look like? They usually look at the exterior elevation review, the existing fabric and details, and proposed solutions side by side. They focus on the sash, the frame, casing. Remember I talked about that delicate window a few slides ago, and the mass and proportionality, and the relationship of the glass to the masonry and sash plane. So let's look at an old window from 1910, 1920. This is a detailed drawing you see on the left. And all the measurements are important because they're shadow lines. They're things that distract the eye, that change. On the right, you see a typical window of today. And if you look at all the measurements, you say, well, that doesn't quite look right. Well, let me show you how incorrect it is. If you look closely down there, this is the difference. The casing width was a 16th out. The casing depth was 7/32. The blind stop width was 23/32 out. When you get these type of differences, you have a window of mass and proportionality that just doesn't meet what we need to do. So there are people who have addressed this. There are a lot of good manufacturers out there today, and that's why I think it's critically important that you collaborate with professionals. It's cheap money in the long run, because here's a solution from a manufacturer that understands this is how you do historic and this is how you match it. Look at the differences in the green there. That's a proposal that usually would get approved. And this is what Mary Angela was talking to when she talked about the overviews and having an overlay. In the red, I hope you see, is the overlay of the replacement. The black drawing is the old window. And then you see the differences in the Excel spreadsheet of what the old and the new match. And a lot of times this will get approved. What if you have factory steel windows? What do you do then? Well, there's lots of solutions out there today. But again, you need to have a manufacturer that can document that to you and give you something that works. Now, I have to tell you, Mary Angela and I did not practice ahead of time, but there are, I think, 20 some buildings at Fort Haze. This is one of them. It shows it in 1862, 2002, and 2016. It's still used in the same way to educate people, and yet the building is back to full use, and it's a great value. Other buildings, the windows were repaired. So no project, it's always looked at on its own merits. So if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to try to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Chick. Okay, we're back to questions if you want to put those in the box. Okay, we have good. Let's see. I'll make sure I get at the start of the question.
Oh, yeah.
I have a local window company that insists that the only way to get a proper R value on a window is to put in a replacement. I know a storm is a good solution. Do you have information on R values with historic windows versus a storm with new windows?
Partially correct, partially incorrect. A storm window is only as good as the primary window that it's attached to and the way it's attached and how square, plumb and square that window is. So when I referred to the blower test, you could do a test to see, put a storm window on and see what that would do. But if you have a leaker of an existing window, you need to first repair that window and properly do the blocking air and water from coming in. And that's just something that you should have evaluated by a professional. But a storm window is only as good as the prime window that it sits in front of or behind it.
In one of the previous examples, the windows were bricked in. When replaced with glass, how important is it to match the glass? Thinking they bricked them in for a reason, possibly too much light, heat, and would put glass back in only if they found a solution with modern filtered glass.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it depends on how historic your building is, how detailed requirements, what detail requirements, how, the strictness of it. Sometimes, they're going to require, and there are a lot of manufacturers, some overseas, that can provide the old stretch glass, the wavy glass we all grew up with years ago. But sometimes it's not needed. So again, this is a good thing to do in your initial research, is take a look, make note in your Excel spreadsheet, take pictures and document what's that glass look like as a typical one. Sometimes it's hard to get pictures of glass, by the way, but I think you'll get the idea when you walk a building and take a look at the glass in all the openings. I hope that helps.
Okay, we're waiting for more questions to come in. Oh, here's another one. How do you overcome objections from a building owner who wants to replace and not repair their historic windows? Slightly off topic, as this would not be for tax credits.
I would ask Mary Angela if you're still with us, but I can give you my quick answer, having spent years in the sales business and the education business from a window manufacturer's standpoint. It was our basic first comment to say repair and document your repair. That's only good building science and being good stewards of the resources that are in front of us. But an owner, sometimes you need to educate them on that theory that we're just here for a while and someone else is going to have this building sometime in the future. So I don't know if you have more, Mary Angela, if you're still with us. I think she had to drop off. I hope that helps.
Okay, I think Mary Angela is not there. The next question. I own a house that was built in the 1880s. I have a photo of the house from the 1930s. Can a professional look at the photo and sense what kind of window should go into it today? The existing windows date to the 1960s. They leak and are hard to, hard to secure.
Yeah, some basic measurements would really help. Because if you stacked up, if you invited 4 window manufacturers to come to your home, and then you really got a measuring tape out and started measuring the width of the sash and the width of the rails and the height of this and that, you'd start to see, well, you know what? I thought all windows are the same. They're not. And what you have to do is know what you have first, and then find the closest match to it. And sometimes that's going to require you do some measurements, put together an Excel spreadsheet. And then, if you can do that, you're way ahead of the game, because then I would just ask the manufacturer, send me a cut sheet of your typical double hung, because it'll spell out what all those measurements are.
Okay, another question. Can you talk more about the importance of the interior look of the window?
If it is the significant part of the building, it's worth noting. I once a year used to have a Christmas dinner over at the Dayton Women's Club, and they had the most extraordinary interior wood trim. And they didn't have to replace their windows, but I did tell the manager, if you ever did, you need to document this in the narrative. I had a couple slides on that, and Mary Angela talked about it too. But I can tell you, National Parks is very strict on daylight opening, and they should be, because it messes with, when you put a window inside a window, you now have changed the mass and proportionality of that relationship, that ratio of glass to frame. So you need to have a good reason, but you could. And that's why an insert window sometimes is a good historic solution.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Again, the PowerPoints are in the handout box. Anybody needing AIA credits, that's in the chat box. I would like to thank everyone for attending the webinar today, and particularly Mary Angela and Chick for being our experts in this presentation. And we'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you.